Before inflation became a percentage point on a government report, before central banks could print money with a keystroke, there was a coin that ruled the ancient world for over 4 centuries. The Roman denarius wasn't just currency, it was a promise, backed by the most powerful empire in history. And then Rome broke that promise. What happened next is a masterclass in how empires destroy themselves from within, one coin at a time. Welcome to the Money Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. In 211 BCE, Rome introduced the denarius. It was simple, elegant, and revolutionary. A silver coin weighing about 4.5 grams with roughly 95% purity. Soldiers were paid in denarii. Taxes were collected in denarii. Trade across the Mediterranean ran on denarii. For centuries, it was the dollar of the ancient world, stable, trusted, universally accepted. The denarius didn't just facilitate commerce. It was the infrastructure that held the empire together. And Rome understood something critical. A strong currency is a geopolitical weapon. But here's the problem with empires. They get expensive. By the 1st century CE, Rome was enormous, stretching from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Maintaining that required legions stationed on every frontier, roads connecting every province, grain shipments feeding 1 million people in the capital, and an administrative apparatus managing it all. The cost was staggering, and Rome had a choice: raise taxes to unbearable levels, cut military spending and risk collapse, or find another way to pay the bills. They chose debasement. It started quietly under Emperor Nero around 64 CE. The empire was running deficits. So Nero did something subtle. He reduced the silver content of the denarius from 95% to about 90%. Most people didn't notice. The coins looked the same. They spent the same, but Rome had just discovered the ultimate hidden tax. You could fund the government by making the money worth less, and citizens wouldn't realize they were being robbed until it was too late. And once that door opened, every emperor who followed walked through it. Trajan debased the denarius further. Marcus Aurelius debased it again to fund wars against Germanic tribes. Septimius Severus slashed the silver content to pay his soldiers more. By the time you reach the 3rd century CE, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, the denarius had become a farce. What started as 95% silver was now barely 5%. The rest was bronze with a thin silver wash that rubbed off in your hands. Here's what that meant in practice. Imagine you're a Roman soldier in 200 CE. Your salary is 300 denarii per year, the same nominal amount soldiers were paid a century earlier. But the coins you're holding are worth a fraction of what they used to be. You can't buy the same amount of food, the same equipment, the same luxuries. Your wages haven't been cut on paper, but in reality, you've been silently impoverished, and you're angry. This is where the death spiral begins. As the currency collapsed, prices exploded. What historians call the inflation crisis of the 3rd century saw prices increase by factors of tens or even hundreds, depending on the region. Merchants stopped trusting Roman coins and demanded payment in goods, gold, or foreign currency. The economy fragmented. Regions began reverting to barter. The system that had unified the empire for centuries was disintegrating, and Rome's response made everything worse. Emperor Diocletian, desperate to stop the chaos, issued the Edict on maximum prices in 301 CE, one of history's most ambitious and catastrophic attempts at price controls. He fixed the prices of over 1,000 goods and services, threatened merchants with death for violating them, and declared that inflation was caused by greed, not by Rome's own monetary destruction. It failed spectacularly. Merchants hid their goods. Black markets flourished. The edict was unenforceable and abandoned within years. But the real damage wasn't economic, it was political. When your currency collapses, your government loses legitimacy. Soldiers who weren't being paid properly stopped obeying orders. They started deposing emperors and installing their own candidates, anyone who promised better pay. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had over 50 emperors, most of whom were murdered by their own troops. This wasn't a constitutional crisis. It was a financial crisis wearing a military disguise. And here's the cruelest irony. The wealthiest Romans were fine. Senators hoarded gold and silver. Landowners collected rents in grain and goods. Elites converted their wealth into assets that held value regardless of what happened to the currency. It was the common people, soldiers, shopkeepers, farmers who were destroyed. The inflation crisis was regressive. It punished the poor and rewarded those rich enough to escape the monetary system entirely. By the time Constantine finally stabilized the empire, in the early 4th century, he didn't try to save the denarius, he abandoned it. He introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, and essentially created a 2-tier system. Gold for the elite, debased bronze for everyone else. The denarius, the coin that had built an empire, was dead. What replaced it was an admission that Rome could no longer maintain a unified currency for all its citizens. So what killed the denarius? It wasn't barbarians. It wasn't corruption, though, that played a role. It wasn't even military overspending, though that was the symptom. What killed the denarius was a simple, timeless truth. Governments that fund themselves through monetary debasement destroy the trust that holds their societies together. And once that trust is gone, no amount of military power can restore it. And this is where the story stops being ancient history and becomes uncomfortably modern. Because every mistake Rome made with the denarius, modern governments have repeated. The Federal Reserve has expanded the U.S. money supply by trillions since 2008. Central banks across Europe and Japan have printed money to fund deficits. Inflation has returned after decades of stability, eroding savings and wages. And just like in Rome, elites with assets, real estate, stocks, commodities are protected, while ordinary people holding cash get quietly impoverished. The tools are different. Rome physically shaved silver from coins. Today we adjust monetary policy with digital keystrokes. But the logic is identical. When governments can't afford their promises, they devalue the currency and hope no one notices until it's too late. The denarius died over 2 centuries. Modern fiat currencies are moving faster. Here's what the death of the denarius teaches us. Money is trust made tangible. The moment a government prioritizes short-term spending over long-term monetary stability, it begins the slow process of destroying that trust. It doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, insidious, easy to ignore, until the collapse is irreversible. Rome's soldiers didn't rebel because they hated the empire. They rebelled because their wages couldn't buy food. That's not a political crisis. That's a currency crisis wearing a disguise. So the next time you hear about quantitative easing, or modern monetary theory, or central banks assuring you that inflation is transitory, remember the denarius. Remember that every empire that thought it could print its way to prosperity learned the same hard lesson. You can debase a currency. You can manipulate prices. You can delay the reckoning. But you can't escape the mathematics. The bill always comes due. And when it does, it doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about the trust you destroyed. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.